Welcome to Masters of Suspicion. This course is designed to explore thinkers who have posed interesting questions about the nature of human existence, working with both the content and the method of their inquiry. The focus of this session is on Heidegger. Martin Heidegger was a German philosopher who lived from 1889 to 1976. In our culture, he's perhaps best known for his early inclusion in Monty Python's classic Bruce's Philosopher's Song, if you're familiar with that. And perhaps more recently for the publication of what are known as the Black Notebooks, diaries in which anti-Semitic statements confirmed that his work with the Nazi Party during World War II was not all for show, which has been the kind of controversy over the past 40 years of Heidegger scholarship. His politics have made Heidegger an increasingly controversial figure and thinker to explore. Despite the controversies, however, Heidegger's body of work, including Being in Time, which we'll be reading, radically opened up possibilities for thinking that have reshaped many academic disciplines. Anything from postmodernism to post-structuralism to a lot of psychoanalytic theories, definitely influenced by Being in Time and some of Heidegger's later works. A lot of analytic philosophy is also written in conversation with a lot of Heidegger's thinking. So it really opens up a new way of thinking philosophically in the 20th century, which then rippled out to other academic disciplines, which rippled out into culture. And so it's a way of, this class in some ways is a way of reorienting back to that original space. The class will not be a philosophy course exactly, although it's centered on a philosophic text. I will not provide a detailed summary of Heidegger's thought, and you will not learn all that can be said about Being in Time. If you think about a class or even of a book as a city, I'm not an inhabitant of Being in Time. There are people who have devoted 70 years of their lives to reading and understanding this book. I'm not one of them. I'm not an inhabitant, but you can think of me maybe as a business traveler who frequents a city and goes to a place, has gotten to know it. I know where some of the better restaurants are, but it's fairly idiosyncratic in that way. My tour of Heidegger's thinking will not be anybody else's tour. It's not authoritative, but it is a text that I've spent a lot of time with and that I think I know at least decently well, enough to introduce you to it as well. Is that fair?
Yes, sir.
All right. So from my perspective, Being in Time is incredibly noteworthy as it offers a model of thinking that respects our immersion in the world. And that's one thing that Heidegger does, in some ways, first and best. For a lot of time, thinkers thought objectively, and I mean the Enlightenment model of thinking, in a lot of ways, was to detach oneself from the object of study or the object of thought. And what Heidegger does that's fairly radical is say that this is wrong. It's an incorrect model, that the kind of truth that this sort of thinking uncovers is a flawed truth, and that there are other ways of thinking that are more true than what this detached subject-object relationship looks like, because it's very infrequent in our world that we ever are forced to stop and look at an object divorced from the context. So what Being in Time does in a lot of ways is opens up a way of recontextualizing our own place in our own thinking and our own relationship with being, which would be the first part of Being in Time, the being part. Yeah. All right. So even people who feel out of place in the world generally remain immersed in it. We're always in our world. We use tools, we eat food, we wear clothing, we attend meetings, we chat casually, we hear news. The world is all around us, and even those who are alienated or marginalized still are gripped by it. You can't escape world. Or an escape from world or rejection of world is still being immersed in it in a different sort of way or a different sort of relationship. It requires tragedy, actually, to even make the world a point of inquiry. When you think of something like 9/11 or Ferguson or something like that, all of a sudden, an event occurs that causes us to question our world in a different sort of way, to question some of the assumptions behind the world. The recent controversies about gay marriage have done that similar sort of thing, to take the world that we live in and force us to scrutinize it in a way that we're not just immersed in it. That level of thinking is odd, and it develops mostly out of a sense of something that's broken or something that goes wrong that forces us to reflect on it. But in our average, ordinary, day-to-day lives, and that's the perspective that Heidegger takes very, very seriously, just the average, the ordinary, the everyday, we're immersed in the world in a thoughtless, forgetful sort of way. And that's the starting point that Heidegger talks with. So my interest in Heidegger's work is his desire to correct the problem of philosophy that appears when we reflect upon our own thinking. That sort of break takes us out from where we usually are into a fairly unusual circumscribed state of being, this one, right? Which is not how we usually are at all. But, you know, how many of you have listened to Louis C.K.? Or his rant about how everything's a miracle that we don't take seriously? Like, we live in a magical, gadget-filled universe where we have access to all sorts of power and potential and opportunity, and we don't marvel at it. And it could be wonderful, and we just don't stop and think about it. We don't look at natural marvels as much anymore. We don't appreciate things. And so what I think Heidegger opens up is a way to appreciate things. And the most, I don't know, to quote Neutral Malkotel, how strange it is to be anything at all. And to contemplate ourselves as something that's strange and remarkable. And that's something that I think Heidegger can open up. So for this class, what I want to do is talk about 3 specific things that I think you can get out of the first 37 pages of the book. Number 1, it's how to become suspicious of what seems overlooked or forgettable. That's Heidegger's starting point in the text, and I think it's a decent one. If you want to become suspicious, if you want to learn how to interrogate, oftentimes looking at those kind of overlooked or assumed or forgotten things really provides an insightful point of entry into a question. Number 2, I think that this section looks at how to inquire after meaning if you're taking seriously what is ordinary and what is everyday. You know, rather than a scientist who has, you know, certain kinds of pristine conditions that can be replicated, our everyday lives are fodder for rich potential philosophic inquiry or thoughtfulness, right? We can think about who we are and why we are and where we are in a way that's serious, in a way that's important, in a way that's meaningful. And the first part of Being in Time explains why that's so, and why those are important questions to ask of ourselves, even in our ordinariness, our everydayness. The third thing that I think is important that he establishes here is how to distinguish between appearances, or between different things that appear in different ways, between ontic and ontological possibilities, and I'll explain that in a few minutes, and surface from structural truths. So in the first part of the book, he sets up a series of these kinds of distinctions, and I think those are helpful distinctions as you think through things. So what I'm going to do, the way that I'm going to proceed is essentially read excerpts from the text and talk about those as we go, and then work from there. The first page of the book starts out with a quote from Plato's The Sophist. Here's the quote. "For manifestly you have long been aware of what you mean when you use the expression being. We, however, who used to think we understood it, have now become perplexed." And essentially this is the Princess Bride conundrum, right? You keep using this word being, but I don't think it means what you think it means. And that's the problem with being. Being is this omnipresent word that connects all of our thoughts and our relationships, but we don't think about it. And we use the word thoughtlessly without ever really resting on it. Of course, this is Plato writing, and it's been a problem for a long, long time. What Heidegger does 2,000 years later is write this. Do we in our time have an answer to the question of what we really mean by the word being? Not at all. So it is fitting that we should raise anew the question of the meaning of being. But are we nowadays even perplexed at our inability to understand the expression being? Not at all. So first of all, we must reawaken an understanding for the meaning of this question. Right? So Heidegger's problem is twofold. Number one, we still don't understand, like after 2,000 years of human experience, we still are no closer to understanding this than we ever were. The problem is, in 2,000 years of human progress, we're not troubled by the fact that we don't understand it. Nobody stumbles over their lack of ontological grounding, right? I mean, people just walk through the streets of Iowa City or wherever, untroubled by the fact that we haven't gotten here yet. iPhones are really handy for that, because you can just listen to music and text and things like that, and don't have to worry about it. But it's a problem for Heidegger. But it's not just a problem, because of course people function just fine without that. What it is it's an interesting problem. It's an interesting opportunity to become suspicious of why it's so easy to not solve that problem, and why we can live without thinking about it. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. Okay. So his solution is to reawaken the understanding for the meaning of the question. This falls short of providing a definite answer. Although Heidegger claims that the answer to the meaning of being is temporality, it's time. That's a very odd kind of answer. It's hard to put that one into practice necessarily in certain kinds of ways. That's, in this class, the focus is going to be on the question of world, not on the question of time. And that will, I think, allow for a way through the text that will become more practicable and understandable, and it will be less bogged down in certain kinds of other discussions. Time is fun, but we don't have time for it, if you will. All right. So the problem that Heidegger starts out with on page 3 is not only is the answer to the question of being lacking, but even the question itself is obscure and without direction. To ask what is being doesn't seem to mean anything. It just seems like elitist intellectualism. Like, to have the privilege of even pondering what is being already presupposes a certain amount of stability, social conditions, social order that allow you to muse in this really unclear, obscure, directionless way that perhaps only come after very, very long, late nights. And then it's a really fun conversation, but you still don't get anywhere, and all the answers that you find at those points just kind of disappear in the fogs of the morning. Right, they evaporate and vanish, and you're left no farther along than you were when you started. So that's the problem. The question itself is obscure, it lacks direction, it doesn't seem to point us anywhere. Heidegger gives 3 statements about our relationship to the question, or kind of the everyday relationship to the question. The first thing he says is that this average and vague understanding of being is a fact. That's just a fact of the human condition, is that we have this vague understanding of being. Number 2, this indefiniteness, always available, is itself a positive phenomenon. And that's an important point. Rather than looking at the fact that we have a vague relationship to it as something deficient, Heidegger instead approaches that vagueness as something positive, right? It's not something lacking. It itself offers something positive that we can grab onto and use as a starting point to explore. What's our understanding of the question? It's a vague one. That means something. Number 3, he argues that a clear concept helps us discern what kinds of obfuscation or hindrance of an explicit elucidation of the meaning of being are possible and necessary. Right? So what he's saying is that if we can get a concept of being down, if we can understand at least a little bit of that, it will help expose why obfuscations, hindrances, stumbling blocks to the questions are themselves both possible and necessary. Right? There's something about being as a question that produces all sorts of roadblocks to getting closer to that question or becoming more aware of it. But those things aren't accidental. They're not wrong. It's part of the structure of being itself, and that's a structure that Heidegger explains over the next 30 pages. We doing okay so far? All right. So, after this point, Heidegger then launches into a discussion of questions and what questions mean, what it means to be questioning. And here are 4 things that I pulled out from the text. Number 1, Heidegger writes, as a seeking, questioning needs prior guidance from what it seeks. Right? So we tend to posit questions as that which we don't know. We will put a good chi, X symbol up there, for the unknown. But to even ask about what we don't know presupposes that there's a thing that's known that we're asking about. Right? If we can formulate a question about it, even though almost everything is unknown, there's still some prior guidance for what it seeks. The way that we ask questions, the way that we pose questions, the way that we approach questions presupposes a point of knowledge or a questioner who has some meaning-making possibilities or some capacity to ask a question or to be an understander in a certain kind of way. The questioner comes with a background of knowledge and experiences that frame what is mysterious from a perspective, right? There's a bias. There's something wrong. My brother-in-law is an engineer. And when something breaks, his interest is in, oh, that's interesting, I wonder what's broken about it, right? And then he'll take it apart and think about it and try to put it back together, because he's an engineer. That's how he approaches the question of what's wrong. When I have something that's broken, I ask who can fix it, and that's when I call my brother-in-law, right? But there are different approaches. That question, the unknownness, means different things between he and I because we come at that question from different perspectives. But a questioning needs prior guidance from what it seeks. To have the ability to formulate a question requires already knowing something about it. I can't ask good questions about astrophysics or organic chemistry. I'm really bad at asking questions about organic chemistry beyond what is organic chemistry. I know that there's this way to think. I don't know it. I don't know enough to ask questions about it, right? When it comes to things like this, I can ask questions because I have a lot more prior guidance, and so my questions can become a lot more specific. Does that make sense? Number 2, what is sought in the question of being is not completely unfamiliar, although it is at first totally ungraspable. Right? So Heidegger moves from questioning in general to the question of being. In that, even though it's ungraspable at first, right? What is being? It just dissolves as a question because you're already using the is in a way to relate to being itself, and then you're questioning how to ask the question, and it all falls apart. And there's something totally ungraspable and slippery and elusive about it. But it's not completely unfamiliar, right? We're able to ask that question, and in thinking about the question, what is being, it has some sort of preliminary meaning, right? You can all think of what that might mean as a question when you hear the question. And even if it fades away instantly, there's still something that you can bring to the question that gives a point of guidance. Number 3, Heidegger talks about presupposing. This is on page 6. In terms of presupposition, or the act of presupposing, he says, quote, a preliminary look at being in such a way that on the basis of this look, beings that are already given are tentatively articulated in their being. That probably doesn't translate as well read aloud as it would if you were to read it on your own. Here's the important part. This guiding look at being grows out of the average understanding of being in which we are always already involved and which ultimately belongs to the essential constitution of Dasein itself. Dasein is Heidegger's technical term for just a human being as questioner or as thinker or as one who cares about its own being. For Heidegger, that way to go through it that grows out of an average understanding always belongs to the nature of Dasein, or that which cares about its own being. We always have our own presuppositions that grow out of our own experience of ourselves, and especially ourselves as wanderers. So from the beginning of, and again, one thing I like about this, from the beginning of the book, Heidegger balances his skepticism about what philosophy is, or his skepticism about our forgetfulness about the question of being, with an affirmation of confusion as the beginning of thinking. Right? Heidegger, although it's a dense book, Heidegger starts out with confusion as the presupposition for his philosophy. It's unclarity. It's an average, vague understanding of the ungraspable, and that's the bedrock that he builds on. For Heidegger, some elements of confusion are necessary to the process of thought. When you get confused, that's okay. It's a positive phenomenon, not a deficiency. Because then you can take the confusion and ask questions about that itself as a different point of content, which opens up different kinds of doors for thinking and questioning. Does that make sense? Okay. So in terms of the question of being, Heidegger then talks about finding beings. And he gives 3 different kinds of beings in the world. The first kind of beings are circumscribed by what he calls thatness and whatness, reality, and the objective presence of things. And the German term for that is Vorhandenheit, is the things that are at hand. And there's a thatness and a whatness to this particular canister, right? It holds a beverage, it has a thatness to it, there's an objective presence to it, there's a reality here, right? This is one kind of thing. And in a later essay called The Thing, or Das Ding, he takes up the question of the thing itself again. A second kind of being is associated with subsistence, validity, and existence. And that's what he associates with Dasein. Subsistence, validity, which relates to truth, subsistence relates to enduring through time, and existence, which is a way to kind of net those things together. That's the being of Dasein. The third kind of being is what he calls the there is. There is sun today. There is heat. There is much to do. In German, the phrase is es gibt. So as gives rain, there is rain, or something like that, right? It's just that there is, and there's a being that has that kind of vague indeterminacy, which is different than the kind of thing that the coffee mug is, and the kind of thing that I am. Do those three kinds of things make sense? Or those the three ways of being that those beings are? Does that distinction make sense? Okay? So to work out the question of being for Heidegger means to make a being, the one who questions, transparent in its being. So Heidegger's specific interest in this book is the second kind of being, Dasein, that which has subsistence, validity, and existence as its primary constituent elements. This being, and again quoting Heidegger, this is page 5, which we ourselves in each case are, and which includes inquiry among the possibilities of its being, we formulate terminologically as Dasein. So it's the being that we are, which has inquiry among its possibilities. That's what it means to be who we are. We're inquirers.